We're on Kaf Gimel Amud Beis at the top, 23b1 at the Mishnah at the top. Parachaim shall pilpul and tamei mishum shlosha kalim, mishum kli kibul, mishum kli machas, mishum kli kvara. So a pepper mill, what they call the pepper mill, is tame, can become tame for three different reasons. So the mill itself was made up of three different pieces. There was a bowl type thing. There was a metal thing that you crushed the peppers with, the peppercorns with, and then there was some type of sieve or sifter type thing that if you didn't crush the peppercorn completely, that would be filtered out, and at the bottom you would have the crushed pepper. So the halacha is in regard to kalim becoming tame, which is mostly, I think, in Parsha Shmini at the end of the Parsha. It's not much in the pasuk, but it's a 30 prakim of Mishnayos. So the bowl is a so something can't become tamei unless it's processed into something. So like a stick isn't processed. If you would trim it a little bit and sand it and make it into a cane, now it's a cane. It's not a stick anymore. So now it's a kli of some sort. Well, a walking stick has a purpose. This could become okay. So we'll see. That would have a separate type of tuma potentially also. But types of tuma are a corpse, a dead body, a zav or a zava, a man or a woman who have certain types of who some things come out of their body. For a woman, it's blood, but not during the time of her period. And for a man, it's something else. A man can become tame from shechazera, from seminal emission. A woman can become tamea from nida, and when she gives birth. And then there's certain type, and kalim could become tame from people or from the dead body or from people who came in contact with the dead body. We saw a few months ago about if there was a dead body under a roof and there were several windows and we don't know how we're going to take it out, and we spoke about that. So that's 2 months. Oh well. And then shratzim, certain types of creeping crawlers. There's 8 types of animals that are tame, and then some other types of dead animals are are tame in certain situations. So in regard to kalim, so because the pepper grinder is made up of 3 parts, we're actually saying each part by itself is its own kli, and each one could become tame by itself without necessarily making the other one tame. So let's say if the metal piece that you would grind it with, let's say maybe a sheretz touched that, that doesn't mean that, and it was inside the container. This doesn't have a picture for some reason, but I mean, it's imagine there's some type of ball, and imagine the old time drip coffee machines. There was some type of filter, and then you had there was a metal piece to grind the peppercorn. There's those 3 pieces. So each one by itself is a kli and can become tame. And if one of them becomes tame, it doesn't necessarily make any of the other ones tame. Anyway, I don't think a kli can make another kli tame anyway, but that's a separate issue. However, but if something, let's say a sheretz goes over the opening of a kli cheres, an earthenware ball, everything that's inside becomes tame if it's not covered with a lid. So there could be things. So things inside of that might become tame at the same time. Though let's say you're using it to hold screws or something. I'm assuming that a screw is a kli, which maybe I'm not, maybe not, I'm not sure. So maybe that could both become tame at the same time. Meaning you have an earthenware cup, a mug, and you're keeping screws in it. And then a toad or one of the types of the shrutzim jumps over the mug. So the inside of the mug and everything that's inside, which would normally be food, but would become tame. But I'm saying, let's say you had screws in there. If assuming screws are kalim, would that become tame from that? Probably not, because the laws related to metal things are different than earthenware, or whatever. So it's very complicated stuff, and it's not stuff that we do on a daily basis or on a weekly or a yearly basis here. But may we have a cause to learn these halachos practically very soon with Mashiach. Tamei. Mishum kli kibel, the receptacle, so that's the regular bowl. Mishum kli madchis, the metal kalim. So metal kalim have different laws of tuma than the kli kibel, and that's the what do you call that? The mortar. I forget which is the mortar, which is the pestle. Pestle. The pestle. Okay. And because of the sifting or sieve type thing which is inside. So Gemara, Tana Tachton Mishum Klei Kibol. So when it said the three reasons, it wasn't saying that each of them have three reasons. No, the bottom one, which is the bowl, that's because it's a receptacle. And so the middle thing is Mishum Kli Kvar because that's a sifter. Al Yona Mishum Kli Madchas. And the upper thing is because it's metal. So I'm not sure if it actually was a pestle or not. In the way we normally called it, or it's a thing that fit inside and you just push the whole thing down. I don't know exactly, but okay. So Tosos points out, even if it would become tummy while you're actually using it, the actual piece that become tummy, that one of the three would become tummy, and the other parts wouldn't become tummy. He says there's certain things, some type of scissors, barber scissors, that if one, I guess because it's different blades and they're together, so there, if one becomes tummy, the other one also becomes tummy. Tosa says that's a lot more connected than these are as you're using it. Okay, next Mishnah. Agala shall cut. So I made reference to this Mishnah last week. So last week we were talking about the machlokas between Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Shimon in regard to Shabbos. Is malacha davar she'eino miskavin, an unintended malacha. Is it prohibited and you're violating Shabbos by doing that or not? So if you drag something, a piece of furniture, a light piece of furniture through dirt, so Rabbi Huda says it's going to make a ditch of some sort. So that is it's a toda of plowing. And Rabbi Shimon says you don't want the ditch, you don't care for the ditch, you just want to move the piece of furniture. So because you have no intention of making this furrow, you're not chayav. But Rabbi Shimon would agree if you're dragging a heavy thing because it's psik reisha, it's inevitable that it's going to make a furrow. That would be usher anyway. So he agrees with that. So I mentioned there's a case where Rabbi, and it's a little bit of an interesting machlokas we'll see in the Gemara here. Agala shakat and tmei medras. So besides for different receptacles or kalim becoming tamei, and as the previous Mishnah mentioned, there's receptacle tuma, there's metal kli tuma, and there's all different things of tuma. There's also tuma medras. Tuma medras is something that if something is used to support normally the support of the weight of a person, a mattress, a chair, things like that people, and that's why I said the walking stick, if you make something into a walking stick, if that would be I'd have to look it up again, if that would be have the status of, if that could become tamei medras because people lean their weight on it, or is it something that you would normally have to actually lean your weight while you're sitting or reclining or leaning. So that's the detail. I'm not sure about the walking stick. So medras is a special type of tuma because if there's, let's say, 10 mattresses on top of each other or 10 chairs stacked on each other and a zav would sit at the top of them, all of them would become tamei. Or if there's a chair at the bottom and there's all types of other stuff in between, the tuma, even though he's not directly touching the medras, that bottom thing, which is something that's normally used to support the weight of a person, that would become tamei medras. So the agala shall cut and tamei medras. Then he tells b'Shabbos, it become tamei medras because it takes the weight of a human, and you could use it on Shabbos because it has a purpose. It's not it's Rashi, I think, says Ein Kli Gdol Mizu. So okay, so wait, there's a big machlokus we showed him here. Rashi holds this is like a little red wagon that a kid would go in and you'd pull the wagon or push the wagon to transport a kid. That's what Rashi says. Toso says it's obvious that is something which is a kli and something you can use on Shabbos because it has a very important use. So Toso says something interesting. Toso says this is a three-wheel thing that kids would learn to walk holding on to. It would go, the kid, yeah, right. So it's a walker for kids, a three-wheeled walker for kids that kids learn to walk by holding on to this thing. Because Tosos holds that what Rashi explains, it's so simple that that's obviously something that's useful in a kli. The Mishnah wouldn't need to tell us. So therefore, this thing, which is only used by the kid, you might think it isn't a kli. So the Mishnah has to tell us that it has these statuses. And it can be taken on Shabbos, but ain't no nigris el gabi kalim. But you can't drag it unless it's on kalim. But if it would be in the dirt, it seems it would make a furrow, and you're not allowed to use it just on regular dirt. But we remember we mentioned last week that in Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's house, according to who was it? Rabbi Lozer ben Tzadok. Rabbi Lozer ben Tzadok said that in Rabbi Gamliel's house they swept the floor before Shabbos and put like sheets in front on. So when the Mishnah says if you have like a sheet over the dirt floor, you can either push this wagon or the kid can walk with it over the sheet because then it's not making any furrow. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yehuda says any kalim cannot be dragged on a floor because they will make a furrow, except this wagon, because it has wheels, it's kovesh. It puts pressure down. It doesn't do a digging motion. It's true you might see an indentation in the ground, but that's because the ground was pressed down. It didn't. You didn't do it by moving dirt, which is the way you make a furrow for when you plow. So Rabbi Yehuda says this something with a wheel could be moved on Shabbos through dirt. So the Gemara says, this kid's wagon, whether it's the red wagon or it's the walker that the kid learns to walk with, it's tamei medrash because he rests his weight on it. Then he tells Shabbos Mishum the Ika Torah's Kli Allah, and it can be taken on Shabbos because it has a Kli, it's not muktzah. Ve'ena nigres ala gabi kalim, and it can only be dragged on top of kalim, let's say like sheets. Agabi kalim in, now again, so I shouldn't say again. Our floors nowadays are not dirt. So these halachas that we were talking about, not sweeping and this, it doesn't apply to our floors that are hard. Some people say you can't sweep on Shabbos, but it doesn't really make sense because the whole thing about sweeping was you were gonna, as we saw last week, they were gonna flatten out the surface, which would be filling up holes and stuff like that. So but that doesn't happen with our floors. Vinagos al gabi kalim. So al gabi kalim in, al gabi karka lo. So the Gemara makes a simple inference. It could only be moved if it's on top of, let's say, a sheet on top of the dirt floor. But if it's on the dirt floor itself, it cannot be moved. My time out. What's the reason that it can't be moved? The ka'avid charetz, because it makes a furrow, and so that's it's part of the malacha, whether it's av or the tolda of plowing. Money. So who would be the author of this halacha? Rabbi Yehuda he, the Amar Davar Shein Miskavin Aser. It has to be Rabbi Yehuda who holds, and we mentioned this last week, an unintentional malacha is still forbidden. Even though you intended to do something else, which was a mutter act, if this malacha takes place in the process, it is forbidden on Shabbos. The Rabbi Shimon, Amar Davar Shein Miskavin Mutter. Because if it would be Rabbi Shimon's opinion, he holds it an unintentional malacha that takes place. It's mutter to do it. The Tanan or the Tanya, should be the Tanya we learned in a Brisa in Shabbos, Stav, Chav, Beis, Chav, Tes, Vav, many places. Rabbi Shimon Omer Gor Oda Mita Kisa V'Safsa. Uvilvat Shleiskavin Lasos Chortz. A person is allowed to drag a bed or a chair or a bench, even though it's heavy and it's gonna make an indentation in the ground. Uvilvat Shleiskavin Lasos Chortz. As long as your intention is not to make the furrow. Now, why would you make a furrow? Maybe you had something that was leaking and you want to make a furrow to the water would stop at that furrow and not go past. So in that case, that would be a malacha d'oraisa. But if you just wanted to move the bed from one side of the room to the other, and it happens to be that it's going to make a furrow, but you don't care for the furrow, you don't want the furrow, So then that's not a problem. So the first halacha we must say is Rabbi Yehuda. So because when you use the wheels on this wagon or whatever it is, I don't know if it's actually wheels or maybe it was more like skids from like a sled, because I don't know uh, how often they used wheels. If they were able to, wheels were probably a bit of a luxury item, and I don't know if they would use it for in those days.
Oh,
You can go to Home Depot and buy what?
the caveman invented wheels.
I know, but they invented it. Doesn't mean they used it all the time. But Ema Seifa, but the last case of the Mishnah, Rabbi Huda Mer'ena Kol Nigran B'Shabbat Chutz Min Agala B'Mnei Shi Koveshes. The last din in the Mishnah is Rabbi Huda says not everything can be dragged on Shabbos, except this wagon can, because it only pushes the earth down. It doesn't it doesn't actually move the dirt the way that a plowing implement, a plow blade would. Mipnei shekoveshes in avacharetz low, only because it depresses the dirt in, but it doesn't actually make a furrow. Avacharetz low avda, but it doesn't make a furrow. So this seems to be a contradiction, because Rabbi Huda is explicitly saying it doesn't make a furrow, so therefore it's mutter. That implies um, but the first halacha said we held that it makes a furrow, and so Rabbi Huda is one who forbids it. So how could Rabbi Huda in the first case in the first halacha of our Mishnah say that it can only be dragged? It can't be dragged on dirt because it's implied if you drag it on dirt, it's going to make a furrow. And Darshan Miskaven is also. But in the second case, he says you're allowed to move it over dirt because it doesn't actually make a furrow. It only makes a depression. It compacts the dirt underneath it. So what does Rabbi Yehuda hold? This or that? He can't hold both. So the Gemara says, Trey Tanaim Alibid Rabbi Yehuda. They are two different Tanaim who authored it within the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So one held Rabbi Yehuda. Uh, they both said within Rabbi Yehuda. So the second one that said Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he felt that it doesn't make it only compresses it, so it's not a problem. The first Tana either held that Rabbi Yehuda he felt Rabbi Yehuda would hold this as prohibited, or he didn't think of the case that it only presses it down and it doesn't actually move the dirt. But so this is something that we have sometimes in the Gemara, that this concept of to resolve a contradiction of between two Tanaim, between the same Tana, is that it was two slightly later Tanaim who were both saying something within one Tana's opinion, but they came to a different conclusion of what the Tana said. Or sometimes it seems that they claim that he told them different things. Okay. Hadran alach Yom Tov, we'll return to you the second perek of Beitza, third perek. Okay, so ain't sudden min habiborim b'Yom Tov. We are not allowed to, so we're on 23b3. We're not allowed to trap or catch fish from the fish ponds. So we're talking about the ponds that were made just to be able to have the fish. It's not wild caught. But you're not allowed to trap these fish from the Beberim. And it seems that even the old French word was Weber, Rashi says. So the enosufnem izonos, and you're not allowed to feed these fish either. You're allowed to trap wild animals or fowl, birds, from Beberim, from the places where you keep I guess you would call it Rashi says you got these things before Yontif and now you put it into your fenced property. So they're not completely trapped, but you still have to do a little bit of effort to actually track them down. And you are allowed to feed them. Rashi says in the winter time that they can't find their own food, or even in the summertime, if people are constantly going there, they wouldn't be able to find their own food. So we mentioned a few weeks ago that there is a Havamina that you would be, or there is a Shita, was it even Rabbi Akiva's opinion, that you're allowed to feed your domesticated pets or on Yantif because because they're dependent on you for their food. So Chayos and Ophos, let's say deer and chickens, you don't usually have to feed them. The chickens just go around and find stuff. A few years ago, there was, I forgot which came first, which was the cause and which was the effect, but people I think it was in the Northeast, but keeping chickens on their property, and some places were against it, and it causes some health problems. But it was because there was an uptick in ticks a few years ago, and they said if you have chickens, the chickens are going to eat the ticks, so it would help with the tick problems. I don't know if that was an efficient way of keeping the ticks under control, but that was a proposed and so because these animals, if they're now in their environment where they wouldn't really have their regular food, you're allowed to feed them on Yantav also. You put food in front of them. It's not like you actually put it in their mouths. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, "Lo kol bibarim shavim." These different enclosures aren't all the same. Zahaklal, this is the rule. Kol hamachusar tzeda aser. If this animal still hasn't been trapped, you're not allowed to trap it and you're not allowed to feed it. But if it's considered caught already now and you don't need to do any more uh, capturing it or trapping it, it is allowed to take it on Yantif. Okay. So very, very important machlokas Yishonim. So Rashi says, even though shchita and baking and cooking are avos malachos, but you're allowed to do it on Yantif because you can't do it from Erev Yantif. Because if you do shchita, you're worried that if you shach from the day before Yantif, we're worried it's going to start decaying because they didn't have refrigerators back then. Um, and baking, we said it's better when it's fresher than when it's not fresh. But if you wanted to have one of these specific animals, a bird or a deer, you have to catch it before Yantif because, or even if it's fish, you can catch the fish before Yantif and leave it in a small bucket, let's say, so it's not dead yet and it's not going to start smelling from being dead. And we would let you shacht it or kill the fish on Yantif, but you would have to have it in a very small enclosed thing where it's very easy to capture. You're not actually doing an act of capture on Yantif. The Ran does not agree with that. So he says, so according to Rashi, it means that trapping on Yantif is Asr Midiraisa. And the Ran says, but Midiraisa, there's no distinction from cooking itself if it was possible the day before or not. We allow you to do everything on Yantif itself. The only thing there's a machlokas about is machshirei ochel nefesh, which we saw last week or 2 weeks ago. The preparations, there's a machlokas if they could be done, if the preparations for the cooking are allowed to be done on Yantif or must be done before Yantif. And if Rashi only holds it to Asr B'Dirabanan, so that doesn't necessarily make so much sense either because if it's only Asr B'Dirabanan, if you went fishing, so in those days I guess they fished with nets, mostly he's saying, and not with pole and a hook. If you fished Erev Yantif, you didn't get anything, so you tried, so you should be allowed to try again on Yantif itself, so you'll have your fresh fish for your fish for Yantif. Meaning, because let's say a haircut, Chazal say you're not allowed to get a haircut on Chol Moed to make sure you got a haircut before. So if you didn't try to get your food before Yantif, we can understand the Chachamim wouldn't be lenient if it's only a machlok, if it's only a Midrabanan, they wouldn't be lenient for you to capture. Oh, I didn't get fish before Yantif, so I can do it on Yantif. Well, if you tried, then they would say because you tried before Yantif, we'll let you do it on Yantif, even though if you didn't try, we say it's Asr Midrabanan. But if you did try and you didn't get anything, you could try again today. And then
That's why we Ashkenazim ate so much gefilte fish.
because it was something that you're able to.
And instead of worrying about, they didn't have enough fresh fish,
Right, okay.
Ashkenazim.
Well, they didn't. A lot of them didn't live near bigger
Rivers,
bodies of
but
water.
there wasn't a lot,
Right,
lakes and stuff like that.
right.
You know, in Russia and stuff like that.
And he says even if you caught it and left it in a small thing, they're not so good. They're worse than spices that you ground the day before, which we allow you to grind regularly on Yantif so it's fresh. So therefore, there must be a different shot. So the Yerushalmi says the Ran, there's two reasons. It says you can't do selection and you can't grind and you can't meraktin. And doing them on Shabbos is an Isser Skila. And on Yantif, you get 40 lashes. So what's the source that you can't grind and stuff on Yantif? Rabbi Yossi, in the name of Reish Lakish, is that Reish Lakish? That doesn't make sense.
That's what we.
No. I read that there's a way that Hungarians made gefilte fish. I mean, gefilte fish means they had a whole fish and they would grind other fish up and put that fish inside the whole fish. So it was like a chicken Kiev. It was fish. It was gefilte fish. They filled up the fish. They stuffed it with maybe they did it with I don't know if they did it with ground fish or maybe it was with a doughy type thing. That I don't know, but they stuffed it in. And so, I mean, I was reading that a certain person said that he went to his in-laws, he's newly married, and they're all taking the bones out of the fish the gefilte fish on Shabbos. So he's like, "What's going on here?" So someone said that the minhag of the Hungarians was to do that on Shabbos with the fish, and Litvaks held that was borer, and you couldn't do it on Shabbos. It was completely other. There's a different story similar to that there was a shalom bias problem that the husband felt that the way the wife was warming up the water was usher, and she said this is the way my mother prepared the water. So Rabbi Yashaber said, "Where's your mother from? And where's your mother from?" And he said, "In that place, the minhag was to do it this way, and where the husband was from, the minhag was not to do it that way." So the Rabbi Yashaber fixed the shalom bias by telling them that they came from different places, and this one followed that minhag of that place, and this one followed there. So they were two minhagim, but we understand why there was tension when they came into contact with each other. So someone else, a more recent case, this guy is alive now. So 25 years ago, whatever, a little more. So he couldn't understand that his in-laws were picking the bones out of the fish. So then he found out because Hungarians they did do that, and Litvaks don't do that. Rabbi Yosef Shem Rish Lakish says the pasuk Achashir Yachol Chol Nefesh and Ushmertimus Hamatzos. So because it also talks about in that pasuk making matzos. So only things from kneading the dough and on are allowed to be done on Yantif. So it's interesting in Shabbos there's in perek there the first I think 11 malachos on the list of 39 are called Sidur de Pas, the order of bread, because it's plowing to get the land the ground ready, and then it's Zuriya, and then you're planting it, and then it's Ksira harvesting, and then grinding and winnowing and sifting, and then kneading and something else, a couple things, and then baking. So it's the 11 malachos that you need I forget if the exact number is baking or not, but we call it Sidur Pas because you need to do all those things in order to bake bread. So Reish Lakish says because of the pasuk of that says you're allowed to cook on Yantav, that from the pasuk from which we learned you're allowed to cook for human consumption on Yantav, is also saying you have to be careful with the matzos if they don't get chametz. So from the kneading process and on, once the water and the flour have come together, those malachos are mutter on Yantav. But anything before that, the harvesting, the planting, the plowing, and the grinding and the winnowing and the grinding, those are not mutter on Yantav. Rabbi Yossi wait, I just read that. Lamai so the grinding and the threshing. Yeah, I forgot to say threshing. And then Chizkiah had a different thing. Hu levado mekanshal yisrael v'lo yidchem v'lo yirkad b'yom tov v'muchem. Hoshkin zero disha. Tani Chizkiah upaleg ach hu levado hare elu meutin mitan v'lo yisrael v'lo yidchem v'lo yirkad b'yom tov. From here, says Chizkiah, I don't exactly understand the limud. You can harvest or grind or thresh, that the machlokas is between the two explanations. According to the first one, taking out the bad stuff is still asur. According to Chizkiah, that would be mutter. So the Ran says it seems from the sheet of the Yerushalmi that grinding and all these things are asur midiraisa, and that's not the same thing as our bavli, because in the bavli we allowed to grind peppers. And anything that's ground normally is the same halacha as grinding the flour, the wheat kernels into flour. So the Bavli does not forbid grinding. So the Ramban, so the Bavli can't hold like that, but that's what Yerushalmi says. So then the Ran says the Ramban says in the Machamos, so only the things to prepare food to eat is allowed on Yantif. For example, baking and cooking and things like that. But to trap living animals that are not normally in your field, meaning a cow is not a wild animal, so or a bull, that's not a problem to get. But a deer, it's not so easy to catch, even if it's well, the machlokas in our Mishnahs, if you already have it in your fenced-in property. And how big is your fenced-in property? We're not talking about, hundreds of acres in Texas or Nebraska, because that's not considered, okay, it's in a fence, but it's not practically easily reachable. And certainly to pick something that was growing is certainly asur. So again, the main question is why can't we grind wheat, but you're allowed to grind spices in the normal way? So the Ramban says, according to the Bavli, that the malachos of ochel nefesh that we're not allowed to do on Yantif are only asur midrabbanan. So the Chachamim said things that are usually done in big quantities. You don't grind your bread just for what you're going to bake today. When you grind up wheat into flour, you do a lot at a time. And when you harvest, you don't just harvest a couple things for what you do today. Once you're harvesting, you harvest a whole bunch. So, but when you grind spices, you always grind them in small batches. So even though grinding for spices is the same halacha of grinding wheat into flour, they didn't forbid it because the normal way of grinding spices is just to grind a little bit of what you need for the day. Now, well, what's something that became a big thing in the last 20 years like that? Grinding your coffee beans. That people only grind their coffee. So some people, like I remember 30 years ago, Dunkin' Donuts had in the bag they sold it as beans, but they had a grinder right there. So if you didn't have a grinder at home, you would grind the whole pound of coffee right then. And the grocery stores also. Right. So you go to the right. So you didn't grind, but when you bought the pound, even if that would last you a month, So you would grind it at 10. But some people, it's not fresh enough, and then they have their little grinders at home, and only the thing they're going to grind that day. So we see that's the shchikas chamamanim. That's what the Gemara is talking about. And so for nowadays, our spices are the opposite. We buy all our spices around, and some people, the coffee is what. Okay, so it's just important to know. So that's the there's more what to say, but that's a very important machlokas to know about. And Tosfos seems to be similar to that Ramban, and he goes back to Daf Gimel. Okay, so let's start the Gemara on Kafdalad Amid Aleph on 24a1. Or a minhu, I'll ask a contradiction between our Mishnah and this Brisa. Pens or enclosures for wild animals or birds, you're not allowed to take something from them on Yantif. Ve'enos and fnei mizonos. And you're not allowed to put food in front of them. So kasha chaya chaya, kasha ofos ofos. So both dinim are contradict. Well, our Mishnah says wild animals and birds, you're allowed to take them from this enclosure, and you're allowed to put food in front of them. And this Brisa says you can't do for either. So it's a contradiction of what you're allowed to do for birds, and it's foul, and it's a machlokas what you're allowed to do for a wild animal, let's say a deer. So bishlam chaya chaya lokasha, we could say that wild animal, the Mishnah saying that you're allowed to take the wild animal that's in the enclosure, and the Brisa says that you're not. That's not a contradiction. Rabbi Huda, Rabbanan. One of them follows the opinion of Rabbi Huda. One of them follows the opinion of the Rabbanan. Because we learned in a Mishnah in Shabbos, Rabbi Huda Mer Hatzad Tzipor LeMigdal. If you trap a bird by getting it into, let's say, a dresser or something like that, with tzvila bias, or you were able to direct a deer to go inside a house, chayav. That's considered trapping. So the bias would the mechayev of all the bebar and low. So that implies that only if you got it into a house that's a well enclosed thing, and you're going to be able. And so the deer is considered trap. But if you only put it into a fenced in area that's not as enclosed as a house, so you would not be chayav for trapping the animal on Shabbos or Yantif, but they're talking about Shabbos, because just because you get it into a fenced area doesn't mean it's trapped yet. The Chachamim Omrim, and the Chachamim say Tzipur LeMigdal, if you get a bird into this big piece of furniture, it has a cabinet, a door, so the door is open, the bird is there, and you close the door, so now the bird is trapped there. That is considered trapping the bird. And if you get a deer into a garden or to a courtyard or to this enclosed baybar, that is being trapped. So Rabbi Yehuda would hold that into the courtyard of the baybar, it's still not considered trapped yet. So that would be our Mishnah So our Mishnah that said you're allowed to take it out of the baybar would have to hold like the Chachamim that it was already trapped. So it's no problem to take it on Yantif and then to shacht it. But the Brisa that says you're not allowed to must be Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that it's not considered trapped yet. But it's still a contradiction. How come the Mishnah says you can't capture a bird either, and the Brisa says that our Mishnah says you are allowed to take the bird, and the Brisa says you're not. Hanami lokasha haba beber makura haba inoshen makura. And if you want to say that the difference is it an enclosed area that also has a roof over it versus not? Because if it's for birds and if it has a ceiling of some point type over it, then the bird is trapped, and so therefore you'd be allowed to take that bird on Yantif. I'm just saying chickens don't fly, so I don't know if this would apply for chicken, or it's more for like a pheasant or a pigeon, something that could actually fly, as they used to eat those things. The hababayis to kebeber makura dami uvein the Rabbi Yehuda vein the Rabbanan tzibur lemigdol in labayis lo. But a house definitely has a roof over it, and Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim both agree that that a bird being in the house is not considered trapped yet, even though it's enclosed and there's a roof over it. Both of them, the Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, both hold that the bird isn't considered trapped until it's in a very small area, like a closet door or a cabinet that it's trapped inside there. So Amar Rabba Bar Huna, Rabba Bar Huna says, Hacha b'tzipor dror eskina. We're talking about some type of wild bird. She'ena b'kavelos maros. It doesn't accept that anyone could be its master or its owner. The Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel, because Yeshiva Rabbi Shmuel taught Lama Nikar Shema Tzipor Dror. Why is it called the Tzipor Dror? Shadar B'Bayis K'Vesade. It could live in a house like in a field. It keeps going from place to place, and you aren't able to hold it down. So this type of bird, it's usher to get on Yontif. But a bird that isn't so opposed to, it's not so wild like this, that type of bird you're allowed to capture on Yontif if it's in the enclosure. And once we came to this answer, so the Gemara does this sometimes. It's not so often, but the way we answered that our Mishnah says a wild animal you are allowed to take once it's in the enclosure on Yontif, it's not considered trapping, and the Beitza says no. We're saying this answer works better for that also. I mean, I think we saw cases like that in Ksuvos also, but the Gemara is saying once we said this answer, we could give the other answer nami. Haba bever cotton, haba bever gadol. The difference between a chaya is if it's a small enclosure, it's already considered captured, and you're allowed to take that on Yontif. But if it's a bigger enclosure, just because the deer is in the big enclosure doesn't mean it's easy to capture the deer. So to get that deer on Yontif is a malacha. You're not allowed to trap that. So now, what's the question? Well, what's big and what's small? So that's what the Gemara asks next. Hechidami beber kadon, hechidami beber gadol. So what's the case? What's the definition of a small enclosure and what's a big enclosure? So what's the limit when if I get it into 500 square feet, an acre? Well, how much? When is it considered small? And I could get this, and if I get the deer into this enclosure, I'm allowed to grab it on Yontif to shacht it. So Amar Avashi, Kol Hecha Dorait Abasra Umatila B'Chad Shifya. If you could get near it and then dive for it and get it right away, Baber cotton. That's considered a small Baber, and you're allowed to take the chaya from that on Yontif. Idach Baber Gadol. Anything other than that is considered a big one, and you're not allowed to take that animal on Yontif. Inami, or if there's a lot of corners, Baber Gadol, then it's a large enclosure because you get it into one corner, but if it goes into another one, you're back to square one. So that's considered a big enclosure. The Edach Baber Khan, but if it doesn't have these corners where the animal can keep darting to, is a small one. Inami, or a third explanation, if the shadows of the wall reaches the other wall, Baber cotton, it's small, Baber Gadol. And anything, if it's the shadows of one aren't able to reach the shadows of the other, then it is a large Baber, and you're not allowed to even if you got the deer in there before Yontif, you're not allowed to take that deer into Shabbos. I mean on Yontif. So Rashi said, Toso says, so I mean, if I have one that's 15 feet walls, the shadow is going to reach. It doesn't make it a smaller enclosure. So Toso says they built things uniformly. So they had a standard height for these babers. Nowadays, normally you build a fence, it's like a 6-foot fence, right? That's the standard for us nowadays. But in time of the Gemara, these baber, they all had a standard size, whether it was 6 feet, whether something else, I don't know. But they had a standard size, so that's how they knew how far the shadow would reach. How far is the shadow? Only the shadow knows, right? Okay, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel lo kolei berum shavim. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says not all of these enclosures are the same. If it still needs to be trapped, then you're not allowed to trap it, even if it's already in the baber. Rav Yosef, so that's what he said in the Mishnah. So Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yosef said the name of Rav Yehuda, said the name of Shmuel. Halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. We pass on Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Amrle Abaye halacha mechal de pligi. The fact that it says we pass like it implies that there's machlokas about it. So if we pass Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, what is he saying different than the way we just explained the Tanakama? We just explained the Tanakama that it has to be talking about a small enclosure. We had three different explanations of what small is, but definitely it seems that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel isn't really saying anything different than the way we explained the Tanakama. So how else would you either explain the Tanakama? So that is arguing on Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, or what is Rabbi Shimon Gamliel adding to what we just said about the Tanakama? That there's a difference between between not all babers are created equal, and so what's the situation? So Amarle Uman Afkalaf Mina. What does it matter to you? This is how we paskin. So what does it matter if what the exact parameters of what he's saying, what they're saying? We know that some babers, if it's small enough, it's considered trapped already before Yantif, so you can take that deer on Yantif. And some babers are not small enough; they're too big, and even though the animal is in there, you still have to exert a certain amount of effort to capture it. So that would be considered trapping on Yantif, which is also. So Amarle Gemara Zamorta Tehei. If you're saying that I should learn Gemara, then it should just be a song. So meaning if you're just saying, this is what it is, just make a song out of it. So anyone, even, little kids with no understanding can memorize the rules. We wanted to have the analysis. So teach us so we can analyze it properly. If it's just, take my word for it, that's not Gemara. That's a folk saying. That's what Rashi seems to be saying. Mashal shotemhu. Okay, so that's two dots. So so this is general rule. If it still needs to be trapped, then you're not allowed to capture it on Yantif. So So what is it? So what's the when you say if it still needs to be trapped? So what is that getter? What is considered still needs to be trapped? Amr Rav Yosef, Amr Rav Huda, Amr Shmuel, Kol Amr Have Mitzura Unsudanu. If it's hard enough to get that you ask someone, let's get a net or a trap so we can trap it. If it's that you need to do that much, then it's usher to capture that animal on Yantif. But for geese and chickens, we say get a trap so we can catch it. Vitanya, and we learned in the Beitza, Potter. We have a Beitza that if you trap geese, chickens, there's certain types of doves, it's not considered trapping. So even though you use a trap, these are considered fully domesticated animals, and that it's already considered trapped. So even if you use a trap to get it, it's not considered halachically trapping. That's asur on Shabbos or Yantiv. So Amar Rabbi Bar Huna Amar Shmuel, Rabbi Bar Huna Amar Shmuel answered, Halalu boin lekluvim le'eret. No, these return to their coops in the evening. V'halalu ein boin lekluvim le'eret. So if they come back to the coop in the evening, then it's considered captured, even if you would use a trap for it. But if these other animals that we're saying that these types of geese and chickens and doves that you need to capture, or that they don't return to their coops in the evening, so then they're not considered so domesticated, and to capture those animals on Shabbos would be violating the malach of trapping. So then the Gemara asks for a yone shovach v'yone aliyah. doves that live in a dovecote, which we learned about at the beginning, like on Daf Gimel, I think, and for a few daf over there, and Yone Aliyah, and doves that live in on top of a house, the Bain Lekluv Arabs, they come into their uh dovecote or their nest, whatever, in the evening. Vitanya, but we learned in the Brisa, Hatzad Yone Shavach Yone Aliyah, B'Tmem Shakinu B'Tfichim Beberos Chayim. But he said if you capture those types of birds on Shabbos or Yantif, or birds that live in jars in very large mansions, you are chayev, because even though they return to a certain place, it's not considered coming to their coops. There's some type of difference between chickens and geese going to a coop and these doves that go to their specific nest or their specific dovecote. So Ella Amar Rabba Bar Huna Amar Shmuel, so Rabba Bar Huna Amar Shmuel gave a different explanation. Allah ban the kluv erev. The geese and chickens return to their coops in the evening, and you have to feed them. And the ones that you're not allowed to capture on Yantif are the ones that, even though they come to their nests or whatever you want to call them, their coops in the evening, they feed themselves during the day. You don't have to give them food. But the geese and the chicken, you have to feed. So that's considered already captured, and you're allowed to catch it on Yantif. Rav Mari gives a different explanation. The doves can escape from people trying to catch them. The people are trying to catch them. So therefore, it's really considered trapping if you catch them. But these other chickens and geese, they don't. If you want to get it, they're not going to get away from you. So even if you want to use a Mitsuda, but it's considered as if they're already trapped. So it's not a problem to capture them on Yantif or Shabbos. So kulanami avidu, but all animals could slip away from you when you're trying to get it. So lekluvan kamrina davidu. No, we mean that even if so the chickens or the geese that are in their coop, they're not going to get away from you if you're trying to get them in the coop. But the doves, they're in their dovecote. They're gonna, even if you try to get them there, they're gonna fly away and you won't be able to get them. Therefore, they're considered something that's not considered captured. If you want to use that on Yantif, so you'd have to put it in, let's say, some type of cage where it won't be able to get away from you on Yantif. We got to the Mishnah, and God willing, next week.